So I made this really short because I wanted to have more time for Q&A.
My older stepsister, her husband committed suicide when she had, let's see, Carol was 6, 8, and then the twins were 12.
Mm-hmm.
And I've watched these girls grow up. Their mom was like a high achiever, major attorney in a big law firm. And I've kind of watched them grow up. And I'm wondering, as somebody who cares for them and still is kind of in touch with them, I know like the chickens come home to roost a little bit later in life, sometimes with childhood trauma. So in what way could I be a support to them, and how do you think that impacted those girls?
So thank you for asking that question. How old were these children when your friend passed away?
So their father committed suicide when they were 6, 8, and then the twins were 12. So they're before that, like 15 to 20.
But still, so this is a very crucial age of cognitive development and neural development for children. The best way you can be of support to them is to know that you're just there.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most powerful phrase I find in dealing with someone who's going through trauma or through a loss, it's not saying I'm sorry for you, I'm here for you. Just knowing they have someone they can talk to. You don't have to be the person to fix it. You don't have to be the person to help them overcome it. But what you are there for is you are able to just hold the space for their healing.
Mm-hmm.
Just know
I mean,
that
they're
there.
all grown now. I think the youngest, she is a sophomore, junior in college.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one that I worry about. Like there's alcoholism in that in their dad's side of the family, and there's one daughter who I'm worried like could go down that path, and yeah. It's a big question.
It's a big question, but maybe just a way to maybe just move the dialogue into the conversation is sometimes let me say it this way. Because the brain is a social organ, we hurt when we see those we love suffer. And so sometimes it's our natural instinct as social beings to want to heal the person. Because what it sometimes does, it diminishes our suffering. And so I think it was Parker Palmer. He's a Quaker minister and writer and author. And I know I quote him in the book. But I think he says, the most powerful remedy for someone who is experiencing loss or grief or any sense of just trauma is just simply for that pain and suffering to be witnessed and to be seen. Not to be healed, not to be cured, but just to be seen, to be heard. If we can just, even for our children, sometimes we have this as parents, as educators, as parents, let's just say, we have this instinctive drive as parents, obviously, not to see our children suffer. But sometimes sometimes it's beyond our means, perhaps maybe help them. But what we can do is just say, I'm here for you. I see your pain. I witness it. This is what happened for me after my mom's death. Nothing could have helped me overcome the trauma and the scope of the despair that I experienced. But for me, what was the most powerful source of my healing was to know, again, what I said earlier, it's okay not to be okay. I don't have to put up this false facade of saying it's all, I have to suppress it. When I had the permission to grieve and not to hide it, and just have my loved ones be open to seeing that, that itself was so powerful. Maybe it's not the answer you're looking for, but this is something I think just talk about just in general. We don't always have to heal or cure other people's pain. Just witness it, see it, and love them.
Dr. Kumar, could you give us some advice on how to let children fail in our schools and in other places and be better risk takers? Because now the trauma of failure is so so consequential later on. It's built into a system. And how do we get back to schools without grades and without this incredible sense of failure that they learn early, and I don't know how to get it to back it out so that our kids can really fail in safe places.
Right. And
really live with that. I didn't do well. I need to do something differently.
Yeah. Thanks, Kathy. I think the answer to that question as an educator, I have to give a grade to my students because that's just the policy of my university. I can say, everyone gets an A. It's not like Oprah, you get an A, you get an A, you get an A. Some people don't all get A's. But what I make sure, well, the first, there's a two-part response to that question. The first is, as parents, if a child can understand and recognize that the parent is going to be okay if they don't always win or succeed. It's okay. If parents give permission to children to fail, it'll be okay. And in fact, I'm going to say this. As parents, you need to be open to the possibility to let your children fail. When I say fail, it's not like failing on life. It's like if they're not good, they may not be able to make the varsity swim team. They may not be able to get into college of their choice. You, as a parent, need to love them and accept them, even in their fragility, their failure, and understand that. And so the second part of the question, the answer to your question, I think I said this earlier, you're not defined by the drama of the day. There's a concept, let me backtrack. I did my doctorate work in brain science research, but I also studied in depth Eastern philosophy and religions. There's a concept that comes out of the Buddhist traditions. It's the concept called impermanence. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that everything passes. But in the moment, it feels like it is stuck. So this is the source of much of our suffering as in the human condition. We are deluded into believing that temporary situations are permanent. So the joke I like to say is, how do you make a happy person sad? And how do you make a sad person happy? The answer, tell them what you're experiencing will soon pass. Because nothing lasts forever. Even the trauma and the pain or the failure you're experiencing, it doesn't define you. I chose not to have my mother's suicide or death define me in some way. This is my personal story. I'm not saying everyone can do this, but we have choices. And so to give permission to your children, to give them the choice or give them the option, saying, you know what, do your best. Try as much as you can. All I want to see is you try as best as you can. If you don't make it, you are going to be loved and accepted just as strongly as you were before. The question was, how do we, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, how do we equip our children to face a world of uncertainty, of unpredictability, of rapid chaos and change? And the answer is cultivating one's internal compass. cultivating one's internal sense of well-being helps you to survive or thrive in a world of chaos and unpredictability. So we sometimes don't have control of what's happening in the world around us. Like, right now, I know our country is having a pretty, I don't know where it is right now, but as of yesterday, we're having some hostilities with Iran. There's some things which are out of our control. But instilling in your children how to have control of what's inside, or putting more precisely, learning how to control your responses to external situations. Even as parents, we cannot control what the future or what happens in the world around us. But what we can do as parents and as educators is to help children to appreciate the ability that they have to experience self-control, to understand that the real source of our happiness doesn't reside externally, it's internally. And so I know this is, again, comes from many of the spiritual traditions, this idea that the true strength and the true essence of who we are resides within our soul, our spirit, call it mind, whatever word you want to use. And no matter what goes on in the external world, it's the internal essence that defines and begins to express how we want to experience the world.
Having recently read Joe Bowler's book, The Limitless Mind, I felt it was an interesting component of that was the huge resistance that was put up to some of her thesis on neuroplasticity, et cetera. My question for you is, as you travel around with your message, what are the sort of the institutional impediments to making this thinking, your science, your research, more acceptable? Because there are clearly naysayers out there, and that is a problem as well. I'd love your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I heard the question correctly, what are some of maybe the larger macro societal institutional impediments that we might that we're faced with right now? Is that correct?
Exactly, that keep your message from getting cascaded through society, through schools, to make the necessary changes so our kids can be more healthy.
Right. It's a good question. I would say the answer, I don't really have a good answer for it, but what I can just say my personal experience, I'm finding that this message is being received and more welcomed by audiences and by people that I never would have thought of in the past. I'll give you one example. Well, I'm not going to mention any specific media channels here, but I've been interviewed on all the media channels from all ends of the political spectrum. And what I find is this message resonates to the human condition. It resonates at a very deep level. And why it does, I talk about this in my book. I unfortunately believe that we are in the grips of a major illness. I call it the disease of despair. There's a deeper sense of hopelessness, a deeper sense of not feeling a sense of meaning or value in the world. And so it doesn't matter how we pray, how we love, how we live, how we vote. I'm finding this message for maybe it's a good thing, is cutting through the tribalism. It's cutting through all the artificial divisions we as a society make. And why that is, I believe, is because all of us are driven as humans by core values and principles, that sense of love, belonging, acceptance, creativity, expression. And I know we're in an election year. And I know that things are looking very divisive in our society right now. But one thing, this is the message I'm really trying to advocate. I do it in the book. And this is the message I'll say here. We need to remember there is far more that unites us than divides us. when we forget that, because this is what our brain is evolved to do. Our brain has evolved to look at the differences, to look at the, to label the us versus them, aspect of, I vote this way, I pray this way, I love this way, you don't, therefore you're bad, and I shouldn't be friends with you. But I'll tell you what, I'll say this, I have dear family loved ones who vote all across the political spectrum. And I love them equally, nonetheless, because we're all bonded by something much deeper than our, maybe our definitions, our our societal definitions. There's something deeper, and we forget that. And another answer to your question, why this book is, I think, becoming so, or this message, I should say, is Science of a Happy Brain, it's because it's based in the brain science research. The brain is something all of us, it's a neutral terrain, if you will. It's something all of us, we operate the same way. So I like to say, the human brain evolved for everyone to laugh and lament in the same language. And so just because you think differently, vote differently, pray differently, love differently, doesn't mean that you don't experience pain or suffering in the same way. So I talk about the 4 C's, comfort, contribution, connection, compassion. I didn't really talk about it here today, but it's in the book. We need to help, okay, I'll say this, and I'll move to another question after this. I talk about in the compassion chapter the story of 9/11. And during 9/11, or in any times of crisis, whether it's hurricanes, or natural disasters, it is our instinctive drive to come to the aid of others in distress. This is a biologically wired aspect of the human brain. If you see someone fall and drop their grocery bags, your first instinct is you want to go help them. You see a child at the airport crying by himself, you want to go help that kid. It's an instinctive empathic response that we have. So the story 9/11 that I share is that there's a story that's true, it's in the book, called Operation Boat Lift. If you don't know this is a powerful story that is true. In the aftermath of 9/11, all the highway, all the bridges, tunnels, all modes of getting in and out of Manhattan were shut down. The only means of transport to get off the island was by boat. And so the Coast Guard came in, not expecting to be prepared for anything like 9/11. There were 500,000 stranded Manhattaners trying to get off the southern seaboard of Wall Street to get off. The Coast Guard had no idea, was not equipped. They put out an SOS call and we said, we need any and all available ships to come, volunteer, and help us rescue these stranded passengers. In the course of 1 hour, over 1,000 ships, private boats, ferries, yachts, corporate yachts came. And the beauty of this is that none of the captains asked the people coming on board or fleeing, how'd you vote in the last election? How do you love? How do you pray? Where were you born? None of that matters. And so the idea is that we need to foster that empathic human drive for empathy and compassion, not just in times of crisis, but in all times. As I say in the book, the brain science research suggests we can actually build compassion. We can actually build this compassion muscle in the brain. It takes training, but it can happen. Very long answer to your question, so I'm sorry. Yeah, there's a question over here.
Yes, one of your, I think it was the first R was resiliency. Mm-hmm. And I have noticed that to be very powerful in my own life, and I'm glad you put that out there. But question I have is, So with our own children, I've noticed a great deal of resiliency that they exhibit in work, in home, in dealing with all kinds of adversity and challenges that they've had throughout their life, and they do really well with it, but it doesn't always transmit to academics. So they'll have that resiliency in one part of their life, but not always have that same resiliency in another part of their life. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you for that question. Well, academic performance or academic, success is certainly, a valuable thing as parents we want to see in our children. But resilience is a very broad, it can express itself very broadly. Some children or your kids may not be academically resilient, but they can be emotionally resilient. I have some students who are academically resilient, but not emotionally resilient. So the answer to the question, I feel, is that we're just beginning to understand the brain science research, how resilience works and what that mechanism is. But one thing we are finding, which I believe to be, I can say with certainty, is that when children are exposed at a very young age to, I'm going to use the word failure, or learning that it's okay not to be perfect in everything, we're finding that this might be the key for resilience across the board down the road. Now, the question you're asking is, can resilience be maybe translated or maybe transferred from one sphere, say cognitive resilience, into emotional or social or whatever? I feel that the answer to that question is, it looks like it can, but I think what the challenge is that there are different areas of the brain that process cognitive learning, emotional learning. So this is where it gets a little tricky. So to say that, can we transfer a child with strong emotional resilience to academic resilience, it might not be as easy as we think, but we're looking at it. So maybe in a few years we'll have a better answer to that question. Yeah. But before I forget, I want to say one thing. Well, I think does the clicker work? Sorry. There we go, sorry. There we go. Oh, sorry, not that. There we go. I did this with the high school students. I want to do this with you as well. I want you to become part of this movement we're trying to create here, make 2020 your year of happiness. If you feel inclined, I want you with your kids. So if you are a parent, this is the one time I actually encourage social media over here and internet digital devices. I would love for all of you here tonight to share a photo or a story of you and your kids doing something that brings happiness to all of you. Share it online on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram with your year of happiness. You can tag me, J. Kumar, on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to share these and just have this movement take place. This is starting here. By the way, the book just came out a month ago. And so Aspen is the second leg of this book tour, thanks to Lexie. And I feel that we can do this. I will always become part of this happiness tribe. So I wanted to say that before I forget. Now your question, I'm sorry.
Hi there. Thank you for being here tonight.
Of course.
So I'm a domestic violence advocate, and one area that I feel passionately about is around mental, verbal, emotional abuse, children growing up in that environment. And I feel a lot of frustration around the lack of resources for kids in that environment. And I'm just curious if you could speak to, one, the effects on the child's mental well-being, and how to change awareness in our culture around the importance of of this of mental emotional abuse as well. It's not just about the physical abuse.
Right. Well, thank you for that question. No simple answer, obviously, to that question, but I'll try to address both parts of your question. So the first is, what are the long-term effects to a child who is the recipient of verbal, physical, domestic abuse? Unfortunately, it is severe. We're finding that depending what age it takes place, the effects are long-term, but the good news, because of the brain's ability to rewire itself, we are discovering there are strategies and mechanisms. I didn't mention this. If I didn't or mention this earlier, I will now. My area of research and what I do at Chapman is look to see how contemplative practices rewire the brain. So not just Alzheimer's or looking at neurocognitive decline, or depression, but looking to see how contemplative practices such as mindfulness or meditation or gratitude or compassion can begin to heal trauma in the brain. And trauma at a young age, when it happens at a young age, tends to be wired, because of the negativity bias, wired more strongly into the adult brain, but it doesn't mean it has to be there for a lifetime. Studies are now showing that very simple compassion-based meditation practices or mindfulness training can begin to rewire the parts of the brain that have experienced the emotional psychological trauma. This is again due to this ability that the brain has to rewire itself, neuroplasticity. The second question you asked is, how do we as a society perhaps begin to address this very disturbing crisis around domestic violence, you said, or abuse. I think this is what the book really, in some way, does. It makes people understand that social pain or social rejection is just as powerful as physical pain. I know we talk, there's an emphasis on, looking at addressing, biological or physical pain in the body. But we should not, and this is what the brain science research is just now beginning to understand, they're interconnected. I talk about this in the book. It's called the biopsychosocial spiritual model. So the biopsychosocial spiritual model, looking at trauma and looking at the healing of trauma through its biological, psychological, social, and spiritual lenses. We've always looked at trauma through a biological lens, healing trauma through medication. Only in the past 50 years or 40 years have we been using psychotherapy, talk therapy, cognitive therapy to look at trauma as well. But what's slowly beginning to be investigated are the social and spiritual aspects of healing trauma as well. So social is having support networks. I actually work with PTSD veterans, war veterans, who have experienced PTSD. And one thing that, this is in Southern California, LA. And one thing we're finding that is helping veterans heal and deal with their trauma in conjunction to pharmaceutical therapy and also to psychotherapy is this idea of community. Being with other veterans who've experienced this, and even something more powerful, the value that ritual holds, the power of ritual. A study was done, this reminds me of something that because I know you're an advocate for domestic violence. This is specific more to women who've experienced sexual violence. So it's somewhat, maybe a little different, but somewhat in the same sphere, some of what you're just saying. they found that women who've survived and experienced sexual trauma or violence in their past, when they come together and do a ritual together as a group, they have found it accelerates the healing process and the trauma. So there's something very primal, I'll say the word used primal, about that tribe, about ritual. It doesn't have to be prayer, it can be anything. This is why I think this is, interestingly enough, I say this. In an age where there's been a decline in religious attendance, say synagogue, church, mosque, temple, etc., there's been an increase in these experiences like Burning Man, or looking at these other forms of expression and community, because we need that. So this is where it's really powerful, again, long answer to the question, that the biopsychosocial spiritual model is looking at trauma in a different lens, and looking at the healing of trauma, looking at the power of social and spiritual aspects of healing all forms of trauma, no matter when or where it occurs, or how it occurs.
Thank you. And I just want to say that my sadness or my frustration is around that it's, for children, it's reactive. It's dealing with it once they're 18 or older or on their own, and this is what they've been handed. So I just feel so much sadness around that, yet I'm appreciating your book and your efforts to get that message out there and to turn the
With permission, I'm going to share with you one more story that I have in the book. I interviewed a number of people in the book, and because we're here in Colorado, I can say this. One of the people I interviewed, I think it was for the contribution chapter. I'm not going to say his real name. The book, his name is Drake, and he was an ex-Crips gang member from Denver. And when I interviewed him 3 years ago or so, I met him, and he said to me, I joined the Crips gang at the age of 13 because he experienced trauma and neglect. And the Crips gang was the only community that accepted him, that felt that Drake had a sense of belonging, or tribe, if you will. So apparently, a false sense of belonging and contribution. But the point I make is that there's a good story, it ends on a good note. Drake understood and recognized that he can use his trauma and what he endured and now become a source to help other young men not to fall into the same trap. So I find there's hope, and this is something I find that all of us need to be maybe aware of as we move forward in 2020. Let's not give up on the power of the human spirit. Let's not give up on the power to the testament of the human condition. We are far stronger, resilient than we are told, and it's the power of humanity that always wins out at the end. The power of love that always wins out at the end. Maybe one more question? I don't know. Oh, okay, maybe that's it. Okay, I don't know. Yes. Yeah.
Is it okay to ask one?
One more question. Why not? Why not?
Thank you. First, thank you for your incredibly positive and idealistic message. I mean, idealistic, but realistic as well.
Pragmatic. Yeah.
Pragmatic, but with a huge sense, a very positive piece to it, because that can be hard to come by right now. And also for your courage in bringing together the science and the research with some of the spiritual piece. Because I would imagine as an academic and a researcher, you've probably experienced some pushback, and it's just so delightful to hear those things brought together into one place and hear the respect that that's garnering now.
Thank you.
And my question is, I am a family therapist, and so I work with children. I don't always have the option of working with their parents. I do when I can. But a little bit related to my friend's question, these children, even the ones who aren't necessarily traumatized, but they're in very anxious households, and their parents are anxious. Their world feels very anxious to them. Schools don't feel safe necessarily at this point. And so I'm just wondering, it's a different brain, right? It's in a different developmental phase. So you're working with a different person than an adult and in a limited way. And I don't know if you have resources to speak to that, how to be helpful in that way to younger people.
Very important question. Thank you for asking it. There's no simple solution. So I think maybe a way of maybe answering your question is that every one of us has a part in making the world a better place. So let's say happy brains make happy people. Happy people make a happy world starts with you. So when the individual takes responsibility for when you as an individual take responsibility for your own actions and behaviors, this now has a ripple effect in the world. And I'm very fortunate to be working at Chapman University and with Lexie and here talking on Sunday. Recognizing the value that timeless spiritual traditions have always played in human culture and our sense of well-being. And the science is just, I'm going to say this because even though I studied the brain science, the science is just affirming what we've known for thousands of years. It really is. We're driven for compassion, love, empathy, belonging, community, purpose, meaning, value. All the things that the religions and spiritual traditions from around the world have always advocated. So again, I'd maybe like to say this another way of closing. Just know that you, and as a parent, but also just keep reminding your children that they are important. That don't give up on your dreams. Don't ever give up on. Don't ever feel they. Just always make them remember to. They don't always have to be the best, but just as long as they are happy and try, and I like to say, just never be afraid to let your light shine forth fully and brightly, because the world would be a much dimmer place without you in it. Every single one of us holds the light within, and together we are a beacon of light that I think can shed a new vision for humanity. So thank you.